The research design is how specifically the research question is answered or how the hypothesis is tested. The author of the research methods knowledge base says that the research design provides the glue that holds the research project together. I think of the design as being more like a menu or a set of building plans, because identifying the design gives us an idea of what the other parts of the study will be and what conclusions we'll be able to draw. When a researcher is planning a study, they identify the design after determining their purpose. Then the design influences the variables and operational definitions. It also influences how many participants need to be recruited. The sampling process itself isn't really influenced by the design. Qualitative researchers use a range of designs depending on the goal of the study. A case study involves gathering detailed data about a single person, group, or organization in order to describe and understand what's happening. An ethnography is focused on describing cultural patterns, while a phenomenology describes the meaning of experience. Note that all three of those methods are concerned with describing something, but they differ in what they're describing. Those differences also influence the size of the potential population of interest. For a case study or phenomenology, it might be small enough to make it feasible to gather data from every member of the population. A grounded theory study develops a theory, which often involves the prediction of relationship between variables. The predictions themselves aren't tested with a grounded theory study, though. The population of interest may also be more ambiguous for those types of studies, because the focus is on what people are doing more than on who is doing it. Quantitative studies can be grouped into three broad categories: experimental, quasi-experimental, and non-experimental. There are more specific designs within each of those groups, but we're going to focus on understanding the differences at this level. Experimental studies include at least one manipulated variable, which is called the independent variable. They also include at least one measured variable, called the dependent variable. Participants in an experimental study are assigned to groups to determine which condition of the manipulated variable they receive, or to determine which order they're going to receive each condition. An experiment also typically includes efforts to control for other variables that could create competing explanations for the results. It might be helpful to keep in mind that the way we use the words manipulate and control in this context might be different than you think of it from other contexts. In this case, manipulation means systematically changing the variable, and control means holding a variable constant. It's also important to note that comparing groups of people who differ on the independent variable before the study begins is not the same as manipulating that variable. If the population of interest includes pre-existing groups and the assignment to groups can't be influenced by the researcher, then the study is what we call quasi-experimental. For example, a researcher might be interested in how adolescent drug use is related to relationship quality later in life. It wouldn't be ethical to assign some adolescents to use drugs, but a researcher can recruit participants who use drugs as adolescents and compare them to those who did not. In some cases, the goals of the research focus on describing or predicting, which can be accomplished by measuring variables without a manipulated variable. Those types of studies are called non-experimental. Notice, though, that I didn't mention anything about non-experimental studies helping explain behavior. The combination of the manipulated variable and efforts to control other variables mean that the experimental studies are the only type of design that can be used to draw conclusions about cause and effect. That means they're also the only design that allows researchers to explain behavior. And there are numerous types of experimental and non-experimental designs, so this graphic's just a general example. I thought it might be helpful to emphasize a couple of things, though. First, one thing that makes an experimental design unique is that the researcher deliberately creates two or more groups that represent two or more qualities or quantities of the independent variable. We use the term level or condition to refer to the different quantities or qualities. In this graphic, I labeled one of the levels or conditions as 0 to represent the fact that sometimes the manipulation involves having a group that's referred to as the control group. When the independent variable involves getting or doing something, the control group doesn't get or do anything. The second thing that's important to note is that the strengths of the experimental design come from the fact that the researcher compares the groups created by the independent variable to see how they differ on the dependent variable. The differences between experiments and other designs bring us to another detour to talk about words. As I mentioned, an experimental design is the only one that allows us to accurately make claims about cause and effect. That means we need to be very intentional about how we use the terms cause and effect and the related terms. If the study is not an experiment, we can talk about relationships and associations, but it's not accurate to use wording that suggests cause and effect. Which brings us to another turn in this detour. If we say different things based on different research designs, it's also important to make sure we use the correct terminology in referring to research studies. I've noticed that many people seem to use the word experiment as a generic or general term to refer to research. As you now know, though, that's not accurate since there are a number of types of other designs. Given that, it's more accurate to use research study as the general term. That makes the title of this article a little interesting. After looking at the abstract for the examples in the other recordings, I realized I couldn't figure out what variable they manipulated for it to be in an experiment. They did induce stress, but they used the same process with everyone. And for it to be manipulated in a true experiment, the manipulation would have had to create at least two different groups based on some difference in that manipulated variable. I kept thinking I must be missing something because this is a journal from the American Psychological Association, which would suggest it's supported by a team of editors who would have caught an error in how the study was identified. It finally occurred to me I might be able to figure out what I was overlooking by searching the article for the word condition. It's one of the terms that's used to identify the different groups created by the different levels of the independent variable. The information I highlighted in this slide is from the third page of the article and solves the mystery. Sort of. It appears they considered gender to be the independent variable with two conditions, or levels, man or woman. The sampling procedure focused on heterosexual couples. Does it sound weird for me to say that being a man or a woman is a level of the independent variable? Because it is weird. We can't assign someone to a gender for the purpose of a research study. That means this was technically a quasi-experimental design, and it probably would have been more accurate to take the word experimentally out of the title. In the recording about research questions and hypotheses, I explained the different types of hypotheses and included 2 examples of each. Now that I've explained the difference between experimental and non-experimental studies, we can separate those hypotheses accordingly. Comparing the experimental and non-experimental hypotheses might help you understand how the 2 different types of designs influence knowledge in different ways. Okay, detour over. Understanding the main categories of research design is helpful in several ways. Identifying the research design is like a summary of how the research question will be answered or how the hypothesis will be tested. It influences all of the methods and the analysis, so it represents almost every detail of the process. As I mentioned in the last slide, experiments are the only type of design that allows for conclusions about cause and effect. As a consumer of research, then, it's important to understand the research designs because they dictate the knowledge we can take away from the results of the study. When we're practicing savvy skepticism, the ideas related to research design help us think about the data that's used to develop a claim and the context in which it's presented. That can help us realize a claim is not supported by the data, it's unsubstantiated, or that it's based on assumptions that aren't supported by the context. When we realize it's not supported or based on unwarranted assumptions, it also helps us identify any potential agendas or biases of the person presenting the claim.